Okay, Mr. Watson here, and in this video we're going to look at the cardiac response to exercise and recovery. And in this cardiac response, we'll be focusing on heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. So, as we start to exercise, the demand for oxygen by the muscles rapidly increases. Okay, so it's the role of the cardiovascular system to increase oxygenated blood flow. So all of that stuff from the conduction system, cardiac cycle, etc., etc. We need more oxygenated blood, okay, to get to the muscles. Now, the response the cardiac system will depend on two things. Oh, well, one thing and two of them: the intensity of exercise. So the cardiac response will depend on the intensity of exercise. So we're going to refer to two types of intensity, okay? And the two we're going to focus on, one is submaximal, and this is low to moderate intensity and exercise within a performer's aerobic capacity. So the key word here is it's aerobic work, okay? It's associated with aerobic work, or below the anaerobic threshold, we could say. So on the other end of that is going to be maximal, high intensity exercise above a performer's aerobic capacity. So now we're above that aerobic threshold, okay? So it's associated with anaerobic work. So a lot of this video is going to be about looking at graphs, because you might be required to sketch a graph in the exam. So we're just going to unpack some of the graphs you might see or be asked to analyze. So let's start with heart rate response to exercise. And this one's fairly simple. Heart rate increases in proportion to the intensity of exercise until we reach our maximum. And if we remember from the last video, maximum is 220 minus age, heart rate max. So that would look simply like this. If you look on the bottom axis there, relative exercise intensity, okay, up to 100%. So the exercise you're doing will keep getting harder and harder, so the intensity will keep increasing. So therefore heart rate will, up until whatever your maximum heart rate is, and that will vary depending on your age. Okay, so a linear relationship there, okay, it increases in proportion. Okay, so quite a simple one to start off with, and you'll see this line here come up in some other graphs as we move on. There's the heart rate max. Okay, first up, heart rate response to submaximal exercise. So if I've seen there on the graph caption, heart rate response to submaximal, and I've put in brackets there, aerobic exercise. So I already know we're working aerobically by thinking submaximal. So what we need to do here is we need to unpack what's happening in this graph. And this is quite a common one you'll be asked to analyze. So we have an initial anticipatory rise due to the release of adrenaline. And in our final video on the cardiovascular system, we'll be talking about heart rate regulation, and we'll understand this adrenaline a lot more. But I'm sure you can already understand it now. Like before you're about to play a football match or run a race or do some exercise, your heart starts preparing itself. Your body releases adrenaline, and we have an initial anticipatory rise. And we're actually going to look at this graph through the mode of running on a treadmill. So right now, we've got our feet on the side of the treadmill, and we're just thinking about what speed do I want to run at today. And our heart rate's already increasing and preparing ourselves. Now, what we do is we decide not to ease into it, and we go straight on 12.5 kilometers per hour for our speed. And then all of a sudden, we've gone from standing on the side of the treadmill to running at 12.5 kilometers per hour. So we have a rapid increase in heart rate at the start of exercise. Basically because we've gone from standing to now running at a fast pace. So heart rate needs to increase the blood flow and oxygen delivery in line with how fast we're moving, in line with the exercise intensity. So that's what the heart does. Heart rate quickly increases, okay, and then as you can imagine, stroke volume will be working. But what we decide is we're not actually going to move. We're going to stay on 12.5 kilometers per hour. So then what happens is we have this steady state heart rate. As we have sustained the intensity, we are remaining at 12.5 kilometers per hour. So what happens is we reach this steady state where oxygen, the oxygen we're supplying to the muscle meets the demand of the exercise intensity. Okay, so what this is it kind of plateaus there because we have reached a comfortable steady state. We are now working much more efficiently, okay, and we basically get into our running rhythm on that treadmill, okay? Then what happens is we're finished with the run, we've run our 5 kilometers or whatever we set out to do, and we quickly drop that speed to 6 kilometers per hour. And what happens is your body is not moving as fast, you're not running as fast. So we have an initial rapid decrease. Okay, the proprioceptors, which we'll come on to in another video, they've identified there's not as much movement here, okay, and as a result, we have a rapid decrease in heart rate. The action of the muscle pump reduces, something that will come up during the vascular system. As muscle pump links to venous return of one of its mechanisms. But then what happens is, we were walking on 6 and we don't do it for that long. So we step off the treadmill, okay, but our heart rate has not got back to resting level yet. It will take a little bit longer. So we'll have a gradual decrease, okay? So we started with a rapid decrease and then we have a slower decrease, okay, before the body returns to its resting level. Basically, it still has some waste products to remove, so it's still flooding the muscles with oxygenated blood, okay? So that's what we have in submaximal exercise, and that's how the heart rate responds. This is on heart rate. So let's look at how heart rate responds to maximal exercise. Now, as you can already see on the graph there, there's no plateau here. Because if exercise intensity is continuing to increase, then as we know from the first graph you saw in this video, so will heart rate. But we do have some similarities. And the first one, as you can see, an initial anticipatory rise, okay, due to the release of adrenaline. So we could say here, we're going to run 100 meters, or we're going to do the multi-stage fitness test. So we know how our body will feel at the end of the multi-stage fitness test or at the end of 100 meters. So we have this initial anticipatory rise, we're excited, we're going to go for it, okay? Again, we have a rapid increase in heart rate because we've gone from a stationary position to moving. Okay, and especially if we're looking at this through the eyes of a 100-meter sprint, you've just gone from the starting blocks to trying to accelerate and get to your top speed as quickly as you can. So the heart rate rapidly increases to get oxygen delivery in line with the exercise. Okay, but because this exercise intensity is going to continue to increase, so is our heart rate. But it's at a slower increase. It's actually quite difficult in some sense to get your heart rate to exactly 220 minus age. It just takes a little bit longer. But for example, you could here go from anticipatory rise 60 to maybe 75, 75 straight to, who knows, 150, 160, 170, and then it will continue to rise as the intensity continues to increase. Basically, it has to keep going up because we have an increasing oxygen demand. So the heart rate needs to continue beating faster. Okay? Then we'll reach the heart rate max, or the race ends, or you're out of the multi-stage fitness test, and then all of a sudden, an initial rapid decrease, like the last graph at submaximal, because the action of the muscle pump reduces. We're suddenly moving less. So there's an initial rapid decrease. However, because we took the heart rate to close to its maximum or until we stopped exercising, but at a very high heart rate, we have a much slower decrease in heart rate to resting levels. Basically, we still need to be pumping oxygen to the muscles to clear out waste products. Okay, so waste removal. So we must continually strive to meet until we get back to our resting levels. Okay. And then finally, we have fluctuating intensity. So this graph looks a lot different to the rest, but it's fairly straightforward when we put a bit of context to it. So initial anticipatory rise, we've seen that in every graph due to the release of adrenaline. But this graph would be more linked to sports such as football, netball, hockey, rugby. As what happens in these type of sports, there's varying intensities throughout. So at kickoff in a football match, you'll be standing still. Okay? And then if you've played the long ball and you're the winger and you're asked to put a sprint straight in, your heart rate's going to go up. Then you might jog back for recovery, so your heart rate's going to decrease because you're not sprinting anymore. And then you might get another through ball you've got to chase, so you're on back another sprint, and so on, so on. You can get the picture in netball, football, hockey. These situations of walk, jog, sprint, it's always fluctuating, so that's what your heart rate does in response. Okay, right, moving on to stroke volume. Okay, now, this first graph is stroke volume to increasing exercise intensity. Okay? But the reality of that is that stroke volume is going to plateau anyway. Stroke volume, okay, it reaches a plateau during submaximal intensity. And I'll explain why as we go. So we have an initial increase in proportion to the exercise intensity, but it'll only increase until a plateau is reached. And this is approximately at 40 to 60% of exercise intensity. So 40 to 60% of your working capacity. That's when it's going to plateau. Okay? So, there's the stroke volume max at the top there. So, the reason being is as heart rate increases, okay, towards maximal intensity, it doesn't give enough time for the ventricles to completely fill with blood. So I know we were talking about Starling's law, and if we have increased venous return, which we do because we're exercising, and then that should give us higher end diastolic volume, that will increase the elasticity, that greater stretch. That greater stretch will give us more. If we try to apply that law here, let's just say we're running, because it's increasing exercise intensity, let's say we're running 100 meters, and then at about 40 to 50 meters, you think, let my ventricle fill with a bit more blood. You'll be last, okay? Because you'll be moving slower. Your heart rate needs to continue to match the intensity of the exercise. So, unfortunately, that's not going to happen in 100 meters, and you will continue running as fast as you can, and therefore you're not giving enough time for your ventricles to go for that high EDV so that we can get that greater stretch, that greater force of contraction, that high stroke volume. It's just not possible. So stroke volume plateaus at about 40 to 60%, which is about submaximal anyway, before the anaerobic threshold. Okay? So that's the reason it plateaus. And on that graph there, I've just put in, as you can see, 140 milliliters per beat. Okay, which we'll see some other figures as we move on. And as I mentioned in that example of the 100 meters, it limits the Frank-Starling mechanism. Okay, it limits that. Okay, and we now have cardiac output. So as we know, cardiac output, the product of heart rate and stroke volume. Therefore, the response to exercise is a combination of heart rate and stroke volume. So we can already be thinking there's going to be an increase and a plateau, because that's what the combination of the two is. So cardiac output will increase in line with the exercise intensity, just like heart rate. And in fact, stroke volume did that as well. But because cardiac output, if we think of the definition of it, it's the volume of blood per minute rather than per beat, then we know if exercise intensity is going to go up, the same is going to happen like stroke volume. We're just not going to have enough time and heart rate will need to take over. So there we can see is we've had a plateau at 30 litres per minute. Okay, so 30 litres per minute. Now I want to say here, there's the cardiac output max. In the recovery stage of the cardiac output, it also links to the heart rate graph because there's a rapid decrease followed by a slower decrease because we've gone up to our maximum. Okay, so a rapid decrease as soon as we're not moving as fast or we're not moving at the same high intensity, and then a slower decrease as we continue to remove the waste products. Right, I'm going to show you this in a different graph. Okay, now the figures I'm going to use here would be of a trained performer and the bottom end of a trained performer, but I'm going to show you how we can put all this together. So heart rate will be the blue line, stroke volume the green. Now as we know, in increasing exercise intensity, which we can see from the caption there in the graph, cardiac output responds to increasing exercise intensity, heart rate will just increase in proportion until your maximum, 220 minus h. However, stroke volume will plateau. And what we can see there is, notice how, and this is, we need to pay careful attention here because you never plot the resting value at 0 on any of these graphs because a resting heart rate on average is 70 to 72, a resting stroke volume is 70 milliliters on average, and a resting cardiac output is 5. So it's never 0. Okay? And what we can see here is from that resting of 5 on the cardiac output, we've got up to that 30 litres, what we saw in the last one. But what we can see on this graph here is stroke volume only counts for around half of the cardiac output. Heart rate takes care of the rest. So stroke volumes plateaued at around 15 litres per minute. So heart rate, an increase in heart rate, okay, more rapid fire of the conduction system takes us the rest of the way to get up to that 30 litres per minute. Okay, but the stroke volume will not increase from that 160 milliliters per beat, as you can see on the graph. Okay, it will not increase. Okay, so maximal exercise is roughly 30 litres per minute. Elite athletes were looking at 40, up to 40 is a maximum, but maximal exercise at your top end of untrained and at your bottom end of trained individuals, roughly 30 litres per minute. Stroke volume increases roughly until about half of cardiac output, as you can see in the graph, roughly, give or take. Okay. Further increase is dependent on heart rate. Heart rate deals with that extra intensity. It just beats a lot faster. Okay. So that graph can look complicated, but it's everything you know. Your heart rate's got that proportional increase, and stroke volume's got that initial increase followed by a plateau. Okay, and that plateau is around half of cardiac output. Okay, so in this case, we have 15 litres per minute is half of the 30 litres per minute. Okay. Now, what I'm going to show you now, just to finish off another long video here, I'm just going to show you some other figures that you might be asked to plot on a graph. Okay. So let's start with untrained performers. So as we know, at rest, we know all this: 70 to 72 beats per minute, 70 millilitres per beat of stroke volume, and 5 litres per minute of cardiac output. Submaximal, working aerobically below the anaerobic threshold, heart rate on average from between 100 to 130 beats per minute, stroke volume 100 to 120 millilitres per beat, cardiac output 10 to 15. That's a mistake. That should say litres per minute. That's my bad. Okay. And then maximal intensity, as we know, heart rate is 220 minus age. Stroke volumes hit its plateau during submaximal. So it doesn't matter if we're going up to maximal. It corresponds, that plateau, in submaximal. It's 40 to 60% of our working capacity on average. So that hasn't changed. But cardiac output can change. Cardiac output is now 20 to 30 litres per minute because we've taken our heart rate up to its maximum. So at 130 submax, we've taken it up to potentially 203 if you're a 17-year-old. So that increase of 73 beats has got us that extra 10 to 15 litres per minute. Okay? So that's why we said, or even an untrained, the top end there, we can still have roughly 30 litres per minute of cardiac output with stroke volume taking account for half of that. Now let's look at our trained individuals. So we're going to expect to see bradycardia here, 100 millilitres per beat, but the same cardiac output at rest. It just represents a more efficient heart, and this is why we go on that general rule about the lower resting heart rate, meaning a more efficient heart. Okay, bradycardia, cardiac hypertrophy. Okay. Now, submaximal intensity. As you can see, a much lower heart rate compared to the untrained. So our range here is 95 to 120 beats per minute. A huge increase in stroke volume from potentially 160 millilitres to 200 millilitres per beat. On the graph on the previous slide, I showed you the bottom end of a train, 160 millilitres per beat. Okay, and that gave us that 15 litres per minute. Okay, if you're getting 20 litres per minute just from stroke volume alone, that's your top end elite. Okay, and then we have maximal. Okay, nothing changed on the heart rate, 220 minus age, depends how old you are. Stroke volume doesn't matter whether you're trained or untrained. The amount can be higher, but it will still plateau. So it stays at 160 to 200 millilitres. The rest of it, getting to this 30 to 40 litres per minute, is dependent on heart rate. Okay, so this is where we talk about having a more efficient heart and trying to experience cardiac hypertrophy through training. This is going to get you a higher stroke volume, a higher percentage of free ejection fraction. Okay, so these are the type of things you're going to be plotting on your graphs if you have to plot a graph, or you might be asked to analyze a graph. So I hope this video helps. Thank you.